Storyrobe Final Project, My Understanding of Indigenous Health and Evolution. I proudly acknowledge I am presenting my Storyrobe project from the Treaty 6 territory, which encompasses the Alexander First Nation, Alexis Nakota, Sioux Nation, Beaver Lake Cree Nation, Cold Lake First Nations, Enoch Cree Nation, Amersiskin Cree Nation, Frog Lake First Nation, Whitefish Lake First Nation, Heart Lake First Nation, Kihiwin First Nation, Louis Bull Tribe, Montana First Nation, Paul First Nation, Ochese First Nation, Samson Cree Nation, and Sunchild First Nation. I also acknowledge all the Métis and Inuit people, past and present, within Treaty 6. Robe 1, Self in Relation to Land. The first 2 weeks of class sparked my inner reflection on my personal worldview on land and colonialism in relation to the class materials. I learned that self in relation to land is integral to Indigenous peoples, and there's cultural emphasis placed on reciprocity and respect to the land that all it provides. In opposition to my German colonial heritage, which views land as exploitable, I have always felt an immense connection to land. My background growing up on a farm with acres of pasture to explore allowed me to acknowledge my own colonialism, but I reflected on how I instinctively had a sense of wonder and respect for land as a fluid being, where to me, one life form was never superior to another. This is captured through my personal artwork of a storyboard of a running horse, which I view as a symbol of freedom, fluidity, and the power of movement. The symbols within the horse depict the interconnectedness of the topography, which is the mountains, the animals through the wolf print, the rain, sun, and weather through the lightning, the plants, which is the tree and the flower, which all give life to one another, including the horse. In accordance with my viewpoint, the Honorable Arvist, Pioneers 2019, teaches us that land is sentient, with its purpose being to share its resources with all other life forms, and that humans are not the top of the biological hierarchy. All these learning experiences further enhanced my understanding of reciprocity and interconnectedness of the land within Indigenous teaching. Storyrobe 2, Colonial Oppression. Weeks 3 and 4 of class sparked my inner reflection on my personal worldview on how treaties were signed and how Indigenous people were coerced into signing said treaties. Learning about the historical oppression of Indigenous people is an integral component to understanding the generational trauma being carried in Canada today. Specifically, I reflected on the learning outcome that describes the policies deployed by the Canadian government that prompted starvation of Indigenous peoples, simultaneously encouraging immigration of European settlers. It really surprised me to learn that the immigration campaigns for Canada use descriptors such as free and empty, while on the other hand describe the extreme and deplorable conditions to which the main food sources on the prairies, the buffalo, was hunted to borderline extinction, while other food imported sources were withheld. Mellencamp 2018 explains that these conditions continued until the level of duress was so great that by 1879, treaties were signed just in exchange for food. This was not the Canadian treaty history that I was learning in my schools that I attended. The multifactorial duress to which these treaties were signed is captured through my artwork on my storyrobe of a buffalo skull, which signifies the mass killing of the buffalo, as well as the skeletal form of the starved Indigenous people. In contrast, the eagle feathers were drawn to depict the powerful narrative of strength despite the horrendous treatment, as the eagle is a symbol of cultural strength. Storyrobe 3, Matrilineal Destabilization and Marginalization. A matrilineal societal structure is integral to the successful function within Indigenous societies. The week's learning about the matriarchy triggered deep internal reflection on how Canadian government policy, which favors patriarchal framework, caused the marginalization of Indigenous women and destabilized the matriarchy. I find it infuriating that the colonial documents such as the 1876 Indian Act labeled Indigenous women as not a person. To enforce the patriarchal lineage model, government officials used the tactic of giving only Indigenous status to men and women married to Indigenous men, in turn dismantling the formerly powerful position Indigenous women held within society. Since patriarchal societies treat women as inferior to men, Indigenous women face discrimination not only because of their sex, but because of their race. Knowing the personal challenges I faced by simply being a European woman, I find myself motivated to stand as an ally to Indigenous women and fight against the patriarchal framework that oppresses us. The power of the matriarchy, despite its oppression within the Indigenous culture, is captured through my artwork on my story robe. This depicts a beautiful woman with the world encompassed in her womb, which, according to Leeson and Sutherland in 2022, symbolizes how women greatly impact every aspect of the world, notably sacred knowledge vessels, healers, caregivers, keepers of land, and are often characterized as the backbone of a community. Overall, my understanding of the Indigenous matrilineal society and its subsequent destabilization through patriarchal racism and sexism was enhanced by my above-mentioned learning experiences. Story Robe 4, Cultural Safety and Healthcare. The final weeks of class sparked deep inner reflection on how the barbaric treatment of Indigenous peoples, particularly within residential schools and Indian hospitals, has created significant distrust in medical professionals today. It was really insightful to learn that the cultural safety is not just recognizing the historical elements that created the traumas, but actively working to shift the healthcare power imbalance when providing care, as well as knowing it is up to the patient to say whether they've received culturally safe care. Breaking the cycle of generational trauma is captured through my artwork on my story robe of a stethoscope, which to me symbolizes providing culturally safe care to Indigenous patients. I was inspired by the video featuring Johnny Chase, who reported his intergenerational healing journey began when his father opened up to him about personal abuse he suffered in residential schools. The tubing is spinning in a cyclical manner to represent the Indigenous way of knowing that the time is not linear, showcasing my abstract idea that positive healing experiences can move through time cyclically, slowly undoing the negative experiences that moved in the same manner. The chess piece is replaced with a medicine wheel because holistic wellness requires balance between all four quadrants to attain health, and we as healthcare professionals need to recognize the holism of health. As a future registered nurse, it is imperative I understand how to provide culturally safe care, participating in breaking the cycle. I truly look forward to using the valuable teachings in this course to continue to explore my Indigenous ways of knowing, being, doing, and connecting. Beginning a class until now, my understanding of the history, obstacles, and most importantly, strengths of Indigenous health has evolved. My story robe reflects my journey through understanding how reciprocity and interconnectedness to land enhances Indigenous health, how colonialist control and assimilation tactics, including the Indian Act, residential schools, Indian hospitals, and the 60s scoop, created the colonial shrapnel experienced by Indigenous peoples, leading to the current distrust of healthcare, how the impact of destabilization of matriarchal societies and how the interconnectedness of racism and sexism lead to further fractures within Indigenous health. Finally, my learning journey is brought to the forefront of today by knowing that to participate in undoing the harm of colonial shrapnel, that I must, as a nurse, practice cultural humility through self-relation and critique, trauma-informed care by allowing my patients to lead their care, focusing on their strengths and outcomes, and actively disrupting anti-Indigenous racism using the CPR racism acronym. Using the 4 elements Indigenous framework, I commit to practicing culturally safe care through my understanding of each element. My commitment through air, self, and relation is to understand how colonialism and its systems of power and privilege shaped my personal history and impacted my lived experiences and biases, while acknowledging I can cultivate therapeutic relationships by actively listening to lived experiences. My commitment through water, anti-Indigenous racism, is to address my own stereotypes of patients and actively disrupt anti-Indigenous treatment by treating each patient as though I was caring for a family member. My commitment through fire, service, and reciprocity is to gain an understanding of patient goals and the supports they need within the healthcare interactions by growing patient-centered care on initial assessment, fully understanding the patient's wishes initially, not later within the process. My commitment through earth, land, is to respect the land and all it provides, including the food we eat and the medicines we consume, and to give back by practicing gratitude for the land allowing me to live and care for my patients and my community through its gifts. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my journey.